Electricity Minister Dr Kgosientsho Ramokgopa presented an update on the implementation of the Energy Action Plan earlier. Ramokgopa says Eskom's generation fleet experienced unplanned outages that undermine the ability to maintain rolling blackouts at lowest stages this morning.
The system continues to be under significant strain. As I talk to you, just this morning, the Eskom generation fleet has experienced unplanned outages, what we call an unplanned capability loss factor, especially. This we are referring to the lack of reliability of these units that are Eskom. We have about approximately 81 of these units. So collectively, the unplanned outages just this morning we're sitting at about 18,000 megawatts. So this is significant. This undermines our ability to maintain load shedding at the lower stages.
Ramokgopa also reassuring South Africans that it is highly unlikely that the country will experience complete blackouts.
Load shedding is an instrument meant to protect the grid, so that we don't have issues of low or high frequency. Low frequency when demand far exceeds supply, high frequency when supply far exceeds demand. So it's an instrument at our disposal. So I want to give the assurance to the country, and will not tire to give this assurance, is that it's highly unlikely that we are going to get to a situation of a blackout. Why is that the case? Is because the system operator maintains about 2,200 or so megawatts of reserve margin. So essentially meant to protect the grid. So, and that person will not take an instruction from the Minister of Electricity. Any minister, including the President, is to help to protect the grid. I think that's the point to be made. And yes, I mean, when you generate scenario, I mean, there's a best case scenario. You do also generate the worst case scenario. And after you generate the worst case scenario, you say what are the set of measures that needs to be put in place to avoid that worst case scenario. And yes, the worst case scenario will go beyond even stage 6. I mean, it's obvious that when you generate this, essentially when your unplanned capability loss factor goes up, and then you are reaching levels of peak demand that far exceeds what your projections are, and generation is much significantly lower than demand, you will reach stages that are higher than what has become the norm to be the ceiling. And of course, what we do working with the team in Eskom is to say what are these measures. And that's why we're talking about this emergency procurement, the issues around the open cycle gas turbines, just sweating those assets. I mean, it's about essentially banning diesel, but resolving the issues on logistics so that we've got a constant supply. You don't empty the tanks on site at Ankerleg, and it undermines your ability to be able to run those.
Well, let's follow up on that conversation with energy analyst Matthew Cruz. Matthew, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Now, one of the things mentioned at this press briefing was the need for quick recovery of units. Now, I'm wondering, how possible is it? The minister speaks about scenario planning. Surely this is something that Eskom has been aware of for a long time. So how can they plan for quick recovery of unplanned units going off the grid if they haven't done it already?
Yes, well, thank you for having me on the show. And that's a very good question. It seems to be business as usual that Eskom should be repairing units and bringing them back to operation into the winter times. And that's been discussed previously last year already when it was summer in December. They were saying that they're preparing for this winter now and the extra demand that's coming. One thing that they did announce that they were able to do to escalate the time in which a unit can come back online is procurement from the Netherlands of a stator, of a piece of equipment that goes in the generator that's on an old coal power station that's closed down in the Netherlands, and bringing that over to South Africa. So that's an example of an expedited process that they're now trying to find other ways of doing in order to bring these units back online quicker that you wouldn't usually do in the typical maintenance operation procedures of bringing units back. So kind of going internationally, seeing what equipment we can source that we need in order to bring these units back, bringing them into the country in an expedited process, and then getting them back online. However, it must be noted that despite all of these positive things that seem to be said about the electricity crisis and how we're going to fix it, it is unfortunately the case that we're going to see increasing load shedding going forward, not just over winter, but over the next 5 years. Because of the steps that are needed in order to get that much energy back onto the grid, it's going to take us a long time to get that much generation capacity onto the grid.
And it's very interesting to hear about the level of urgency, what the president said earlier on, what the minister was saying earlier on. What you were saying, it kind of got me thinking of an engine. Now, it was mentioned at this press briefing, the need for stricter maintenance regime, but we've heard countless of times that there is a lot of wear and tear of the equipment. So what can you do with an old engine that's being pushed too hard and is pretty much collapsing?
Yeah, and that seems to be the story of what's happening at Eskom. Is it's thinking of an engine analogy on an old car. It's a car that's now 30 years old, and it is full of power stations that had a design life of 40 years. That came to reach that 40-year life. So think of a car now; it's 40 years old, and then we did life extensions on those power stations of 10 or 15 years already, taking them to the theoretical maximum end of life of 55 years or 60 years for coal power stations. And now we're sitting at a point where we're kind of on year 57, and we're looking at these coal power stations that need to come offline because of their aging. We've also made commitments to the World Bank, and we've taken money from Europe and America, confirming that we will meet decarbonization goals by shutting down these power stations previously. And now we're starting to say, no, actually, we're going to try and make these power stations run a little bit longer. And coming back to the car analogy, it's like saying, okay, well, we're not going to decommission or sell our car, get a new car. We're just going to run our car a couple of years longer. So it's important to note that it's not going to be that much of a difference making the power stations run a little bit longer and not closing them down when they're meant to close down. We're going to extend them maybe like 2-3 years in terms of when they're going to shut down. But they are so old and they've been run so hard over the last 15 years to try and prevent load shedding that there's not much we can actually do to have them running for the next 10 years. They can only run for about 2 to 3 years past where we said we're going to shut them down.
All right, Minister Ramokgopa saying earlier on the likelihood of total blackouts is very slim because of over 2,000 megawatts of reserve energy. But they did speak about emergency power procurements, and here they were saying that they're technologically agnostic when it comes to what can help bring more power back onto the grid. But I'm just wondering, we've been told many a times that we have readily available wind and power energy. Why have we not done much more to harness that than to be speaking now about the need for power ships?
Yes, so this is a very interesting area of discussion that we're going into now regarding the energy agnostic approach that we're going forward with, where we are looking at gas, we're looking at battery. And to talk about the wind and the solar, yes, South Africa is very blessed with solar reserves, and in terms of the amount of sun that shines on South Africa at any point in time, we can get a lot of energy from the sun. And there's been a lot of focus actually over the last 5 years exclusively on getting solar and wind projects installed in South Africa. And if you look at the money that we've taken from America and Europe that I previously mentioned, it was exclusively for solar and wind, with just 5% allocated to battery, but the 95% was split evenly between solar and wind. So in terms of a focus on renewable energy, there is a focus on it. However, in terms of solving the energy crisis, there's a need to focus on other types of energy as well, because solar only provides power during the middle of the day and doesn't provide power for the peak demand in the evenings, and wind is sporadic and only gives you power when there's wind blowing. So you either need large-scale batteries, which there doesn't seem to be much focus on that because it's very expensive, up to 10 times more expensive than putting down solar or wind capacity, or you could look at things like gas. And gas has not been focused on much in South Africa, but is used extensively in Europe. They use 20% of their electricity generations from gas. In America, it's 30%. So now we're starting to say, okay, in terms of our energy crisis, how do we approach that instead of just committing and sticking to our commitments globally on decarbonization? Let's actually solve the problem here in South Africa first by looking at things like gas, looking at things like battery and other ways of storage. And interestingly, they mentioned also demand side management as well in terms of their emergency procurement processes. They're not just looking at getting electricity onto the grid, but they're also looking at incentivizing customers to use less electricity at any point in time. So they announced that they've put together a plan, demand-side management program that my company, Home Energy, will be applying for, and that will also then bring down the demand on the grid as well. So we're looking at a wide range of things now, which is very exciting to see from the government.
Matthew, I want to thank you for your time and sharing your thoughts. Matthew Kgosientsho, as an energy expert, just reflecting on the press briefing.